For over 4 years, Russia has thrown everything it has at Ukraine's coastline. Warships, coastal missile batteries, minefields stretching for kilometers beneath the waves, and entire regiments dug into concrete bunkers along every stretch of shoreline it could seize. Putin built a Black Sea war machine designed around one simple, brutal assumption: that taking ground back from Russia would always cost Ukraine in soldiers, in blood, and in bodies on a beach. For decades, that assumption held true across almost every war in modern history. Amphibious landings against a dug-in enemy have always been among the deadliest operations any military can attempt, and Russia knew it, which is exactly why it fortified the Ukrainian coastline like a wall meant to never fall. One stretch of that wall sat on a narrow strip of sand called the Kinburn Spit, guarding the entrance to 2 major Ukrainian ports. Russian forces had held it since the earliest days of the full-scale invasion, layering it with artillery positions, electronic jamming systems, and a dedicated airborne regiment specifically tasked with making sure nobody ever took it back. On paper, this was exactly the kind of position that swallows attacking forces whole. This was Russia at its most prepared. Then, on the night of the 13th of July, 2026, a video began circulating that would quietly demolish every assumption Russia had built that wall on. The footage shows an unmanned boat gliding silently across open water in total darkness, crossing the Black Sea toward that same fortified shoreline. There is no crew visible anywhere on board. The boat reaches the sand, grinds to a stop, and a front ramp lowers onto Russian-occupied territory. Then something rolls off that ramp that should not have been possible against defenses this heavy. A tracked robot, armed, moving under its own power onto enemy soil. It pushes into the tree line, settles into position, and opens fire. The boat that carried it turns around and disappears back into the water it came from. From start to finish, not a single Ukrainian boot ever touched that beach. Here is the detail that turns this from a strange piece of footage into a genuine turning point. Somewhere on the other side of that gunfire, Russian soldiers were calling in over their own radios, describing sustained machine gun fire hitting their position, and reporting that they could not locate the shooter anywhere. And the reason they could not find the shooter is the twist sitting at the center of this entire story. There was no shooter. There had never been one. To understand exactly how Russia's supposedly impenetrable coastline just got broken by a machine with no human anywhere near the trigger finger, we need to go back to the exact moment that boat left Ukrainian shore and walk through precisely what Russian command was actually facing that night. The operation was carried out by Ukraine's 123rd Separate Territorial Defense Brigade, commanded by Colonel Ole Makuka and directly organized by Major Denis Hipik, the officer leading the brigade's dedicated unmanned systems battalion. According to the brigade's own statement, this was the first known combat mission in history in which an unmanned maritime vehicle physically delivered an armed ground robot onto enemy-held territory and then used it to carry out an actual attack. Not a test or a demonstration filmed safely behind friendly lines. A real combat mission on real contested ground against real Russian forces still holding position. That last detail matters far more than it might first appear, and it is worth being precise about it rather than letting the drama run ahead of the facts. Russia's main defending force on the Spit, the 337th Airborne Regiment, had already been badly weakened in the weeks before this mission, after a separate Ukrainian campaign choked off its food, fuel, and ammunition supplies almost entirely. But Ukraine's own navy confirmed that residual Russian forces were still present and still holding ground on the Spit as of July 13th. This was not a robot strolling onto an abandoned beach for a photo opportunity. This was a machine walking into a position Russia was still actively defending. 18 days before that robot ever rolled off its ramp, something else happened on the Kinburn Spit that most viewers following this story have never even heard about. And before we reveal what it was, take a moment to subscribe if you haven't already. We dig beyond the headlines to bring you the context, evidence, and analysis that most coverage leaves out. On the 25th of June 2026, Ukrainian forces raised their own national flag on the Spit after Russian personnel were seen abandoning defensive positions there, a moment that looked, on the surface, like the beginning of the end for Russia's grip on this stretch of coastline. According to an Atesh agent serving at the headquarters of Russia's Dnieper group of forces, Ukrainian efforts to cut off supply routes forced Russian soldiers to evacuate hastily from the Kinburn Spit. The 337th VDV Regiment, the main Russian unit defending the area, was virtually depleted. The target location of Kinburn Spit itself explains exactly why Russia bothered defending this narrow, unglamorous strip of sand and pine forest in the first place. The Kinburn Spit stretches roughly 40 kilometers along the mouth of the Dnipro estuary, and whoever controls it effectively controls sea access to the Ukrainian ports of Mykolaiv and Kherson. Since seizing it back in 2022, Russia had used the Spit to fire artillery directly at Mykolaiv, run electronic jamming operations across the surrounding waters, and operate a forward drone control station watching the entire estuary. Losing this position permanently would strip Russia of a key piece of leverage over Ukraine's entire southern coastline. That single detail is the moment this story stops being about one unusual video and starts being about something Russia's entire coastal defense strategy was never built to survive. Every mine buried along that beach, every jamming system installed to disrupt radio signals, every bunker position dug in to kill an advancing soldier, all of it had been engineered around one specific assumption: that Ukraine would eventually need to send human beings across that water to take this ground back. Which raises the question that should now be sitting uncomfortably with every Russian commander guarding a coastline anywhere in this war. If an entire defensive system built specifically to kill soldiers just faced an enemy that sent no soldiers at all, what exactly was any of it actually protecting? To answer that question properly, you have to understand exactly what Russia spent years building along that stretch of coastline, because none of it was thrown together carelessly. Russian engineers laid mined approaches directly beneath the water leading up to the beach, installed electronic warfare stations designed to jam incoming radio signals, and pre-sighted artillery along the most likely landing lanes, all backed by a drone surveillance network watching the water around the clock. Here is the number that explains why none of that defensive machinery could actually stop what happened on July 13th. A robot like the one that rolled onto that beach costs Ukraine somewhere between $25,000 and $40,000. A Ukrainian soldier lost on that same stretch of sand cost something no military budget on Earth has ever been able to put a number on. Russia had spent years building a wall designed to make Ukraine pay in lives. Ukraine showed up and paid in scrap metal instead. Now, here's the part that actually matters most. The genuinely hard problem Ukraine had to solve here was never about building a robot that can pull a trigger. The real problem, the one that had never been solved before, was keeping that robot connected to its human operator the exact moment it rolled off a ramp and into a Russian jamming field. That boat crossing the Black Sea was never just a taxi ride. Every indication from the footage suggests it was quietly doing a second job the whole time, acting as a floating relay station, bridging the signal between an overhead surveillance drone watching from above and the robot itself once it hit the sand. Without that relay sitting there on the water, the moment the robot's tracks touched Russian soil, its signal would likely have degraded or gone dark completely, leaving an armed machine stranded on a beach with nobody able to reach it. With that relay in place, an operator sitting dozens of kilometers away kept full, uninterrupted control the entire time. That is the actual breakthrough buried underneath this story. The gunfire everyone is talking about was simply what happened after the harder problem was already solved. Forbes defense writer David Hambling, one of the first analysts to properly dig into this operation, gave it a name that's likely to stick. He called it a marsupial drone mission, one unmanned machine literally carrying a second one inside it, the way a pouch carries a joey, until the moment it's ready to be released into combat on its own. Hambling put the historical weight of it plainly, writing that getting a robot onto a beach might not look like much on the surface, but this one small step for a robot could turn out to be a giant leap for robot kind. To understand how far this pushes military history forward, look at what the same kind of mission used to cost. On the 6th of June 1944, the largest amphibious invasion ever assembled needed the entire weight of Allied air and naval power just to survive its first day. And it still cost close to 4,000 men killed before nightfall alone. 82 years later, Ukraine pulled off a beach assault against a defended Russian position and walked away with 0 human casualties. What makes this failure sting even harder is that Russia was not making this mistake for the first time, and it was not making it only on this one narrow beach. Across occupied Crimea, Russian forces have spent months reinforcing the coastline with Bastion P and Bal coastal missile batteries, road mobile systems purpose-built to detect and destroy approaching ships before they ever get close enough to matter. These are serious weapons, capable of hitting a vessel from up to 300 kilometers out, and Russia positioned them specifically because it always assumed any Ukrainian assault on that coastline would have to arrive the same way assaults always have, by sea, in a boat, carrying people Russia could kill from a distance. Ukraine's answer, quietly proven on July 13th, was to remove the soldier from the equation entirely, which means every coastal missile battery currently guarding Crimea may be defending against a threat that no longer needs to exist in the form Russia is prepared for. But building the machine that could actually survive this new kind of war and win it turned out to be its own separate story. And less than 24 hours after this mission became public, that story took a strange turn nobody expected. Within hours of that footage surfacing, open-source military analysts around the world raced to identify exactly what kind of robot had just carried out a combat mission on Russian-held soil. Several pointed confidently to a Ukrainian-made platform called the Rise, fitted with a weapon system known as Shablaya, built by a well-known Lviv-based company already supplying combat robots to the front line. The identification spread fast, repeated across multiple defense outlets within the same day. They were wrong. On July 14th, one day after the mission became public, the actual manufacturer stepped forward and corrected the record. A company called DevDroid told reporters directly that the robot on that beach was one of their own machines, fitted with a completely different weapon system called the Wally 7.62. It was built around a PKM pattern machine gun designed to let an operator watch the battlefield and pull the trigger from somewhere far safer than the Frontline ever could be. The boat that carried that robot across the Black Sea turns out to have its own hidden history too, and it is just as revealing. Ukraine has been sending unmanned boats after Russian warships for years now, mostly as one-way weapons, hulls packed with explosives and driven straight into the side of a ship until both disappear in the same explosion. For this mission, engineers took that exact same hull design, stripped the explosives out entirely, welded on a lowering front ramp, and quietly wired in the relay electronics that kept the robot connected once it hit the sand. Nobody invented a brand new weapon to make July 13th possible. Somebody simply found a new use for a boat that was already rolling off production lines. That detail should worry Russian commanders more than almost anything else in this story. A brand new weapon takes years to design, test, and mass produce. A repurposed one does not. If the hull already exists and the ramp is simple to fit, there is nothing stopping Ukraine from building 10 more of these landing platforms next month and sending them at 10 different points along the coastline at once. The robot that carried out this particular landing wasn't even Ukraine's most battle-tested machine. A different platform, called the Droid TW-12-10s-7, had already spent over a month earlier in the year holding a contested frontline position completely alone, with 0 Ukrainian casualties, while its operator sat kilometers away. That machine had already proven robots could hold ground. What nobody had proven yet was whether one could take ground from the sea on Russian-occupied territory and survive doing it. None of this emerged from nowhere either. And this is the detail that should genuinely worry anyone still assuming Kinburn was a one-time experiment. Ukrainian forces had already used an armed ground robot to provide direct fire support while clearing Russian troops from the village of Novoplatonivka in Kharkiv Oblast earlier that same June. And back in April, President Zelensky himself had publicly announced that Ukrainian forces captured an entire Russian position using nothing but ground robots and aerial drones, with 0 Ukrainian personnel anywhere near the assault zone. Kinburn was not Ukraine testing a new idea for the first time. It was Ukraine taking a tactic it had already been quietly refining on land and finally proving it could survive a crossing by sea as well. 2 days after the Kinburn landing, the 33rd Separate Assault Regiment attacked another Russian infiltration position, and the ground they chose for their attack was nothing like a quiet, forgotten stretch of coastline. It was a cluster of residential buildings near Dobropilya, deep inside Donetsk Oblast, where a Russian infiltration team of 5 soldiers had dug in with small arms, radios, and a small network of lookout positions watching every obvious approach for exactly the kind of attack they never actually saw coming. Before a single machine ever moved toward that position, Ukrainian operators sent drones up first, quietly mapping every gap in Russian surveillance around the buildings. They found a narrow, roughly 3-kilometer route that Russian eyes hadn't covered, checked it carefully for hidden ambush drones waiting along the way, and confirmed the path was clear. Then the actual assault began, and not a single Ukrainian boot went anywhere near it. 2 droid TW-12, 7 ground robots, each one carrying a heavy 12.7mm machine gun, rolled down that hidden route side by side. 3 aerial drones moved with them, 2 small quadcopters loaded with explosive charges, and 1 larger 6-rotor drone built to drop munitions from directly overhead. An entire assault force, coordinated down to the meter, and every single piece of it was a machine. By the end of it, all 5 Russian soldiers at that position were reported eliminated, according to the regiment's own account. Every single Ukrainian robot and drone involved made it back safely. And once again, exactly like 2 days earlier at Kinburn, not one Ukrainian soldier had ever set foot anywhere near the objective. 2 robotic combat victories on 2 completely different fronts, 48 hours apart, might look like an extraordinary coincidence. It isn't one. The numbers behind this trend make that painfully clear. Back in November 2025, Ukrainian forces were running roughly 2,900 ground robot missions a month across the entire war. By January 2026, that number had jumped past 7,500. By June 2026, it hit 16,676 missions in a single month, an increase of 122% since the start of the year and nearly 19% higher than the month before it. That growth curve is roughly doubling every 4 months, which means the total number of robot missions logged between January and mid-July of this year alone already crossed 66,000. Ukraine's government has also locked in contracts for more than 22,000 ground robots for deployment this year, with over 400 combat units now actively spending procurement funds through a dedicated robotics marketplace, totaling close to $780 million in committed spending. 2 isolated headline stories would be interesting. A curve climbing this steeply, backed by hundreds of millions of dollars and tens of thousands of contracted machines, is something else entirely. It means Kinburn and Dobropilya were never the beginning of anything. They were simply the 2 missions that finally made the rest of the world notice what Ukraine had already been quietly building toward for over a year. Which leaves one obvious question hanging over the entire war. If this works this well, and it's scaling this fast, why isn't Russia already doing exactly the same thing? The strangest part of this entire story is that someone actually saw it coming, months before it happened. Military analyst Matt Osborne, writing on his defense newsletter Polmology back in September of 2025, specifically predicted that Ukraine would eventually attempt a fully unmanned assault on the Kinburn Spit. 10 months later, when it actually happened, he wrote a follow-up warning that should worry every Russian commander guarding a coastline anywhere in this war, saying that once Ukraine can do this at scale, landing multiple ground robots while covering the beach with aerial drones at the same time, the Kinburn Spit becomes nearly indefensible by human defenders alone. Vikram Mittal, a systems engineering professor at West Point who studies exactly this kind of warfare for a living, backed that assessment up with a much simpler explanation of what actually happened at Dobropilya. In his analysis, he said the ground robots functioned as a support by fire position, pinning the Russian defenders in place and forcing them to stay under cover, while the aerial drones struck from above, replicating the same fire and maneuver tactics infantry units have relied on for a century, just without a single infantryman anywhere near the fight. The general assessment circulating among open-source military analysts is that traditional amphibious landings, the kind that once required massive fleets and thousands of exposed soldiers, are now at serious risk of becoming obsolete on a modern battlefield entirely. So why hasn't Russia matched any of this yet? it isn't a lack of factories or raw materials. A Kyiv-based research group identified 32 separate Russian ground robot systems already in development, built by 29 different manufacturers, and roughly 90% of the electronic components inside them come from Chinese suppliers who sit largely outside Western sanctions. Ukraine, meanwhile, isn't slowing down. More than 280 Ukrainian companies are now actively developing ground robots, and the entire market grew by 488% in 2025 alone. President Zelensky signed legislation in May 2026, removing tax on UGV purchases specifically to speed up deliveries to the front, and Ukraine's Ministry of Defense has already approved 67 brand new robot models for combat use in the first half of this year alone. Ihor Shmyryov, who leads Ukraine's ground robot procurement program, put the scale of that expansion into a single number that's hard to ignore. In just the first half of 2026, Ukraine contracted 25,000 ground robots for frontline deployment, which is already double the total number contracted across the entirety of 2025. Andriy Beletsky, the commander overseeing much of this transformation, has been open about exactly where he wants this heading, stating plainly that the goal is to replace the infantrymen on the front line with drones and robots as much as possible. That isn't a distant ambition anymore. It's already happening. Mission by mission, on beaches and battlefields, the rest of the world is only now starting to notice. Step back and look at what all of this actually means. The amphibious beach landing has been one of the single deadliest maneuvers in the entire history of warfare. A tactic that has cost armies thousands of lives in a single afternoon for as long as soldiers have crossed water to fight on the other side. For the first time since that kind of warfare began, it just happened without a single life on the line, and Ukraine isn't treating it as a one-time trick. It's scaling it, funding it, and repeating it, month after month, faster than almost anyone watching this war expected possible. So the real question isn't whether this changes the future of warfare. It's how much of that future Russia can survive before it figures out how to catch up. But the coastline isn't the only place where Russia's defenses are beginning to crack. While one Ukrainian unit was proving a beach could be taken without a single soldier crossing it, a completely different force was tearing a 25-kilometer hole straight through Russian lines, the old-fashioned way, on foot, in total darkness, inside Dnipropetrovsk Oblast. 6 villages fell in one night. An elite Russian division built specifically to hold that ground never recovered from what happened to it. And the shield Russia spent over a year constructing to protect its own supply lines ended up handing Ukraine those exact same supply lines instead. If robots quietly rewriting the rules at sea got your attention, what happened on that front line will do the same. Click on this video on your screens. It explains exactly how deep this pattern of collapse actually runs. This is the Frontline show, and this war is moving faster than almost anyone is prepared for. We'll see you in the next one.